The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood. Of the beef eaters that they were only asleep, and their goblets, wherein still remained some drops of wine, showed plainly that they fell asleep in their cups. He then crossed a court paved with marble, went up the stairs, and came into the guard chamber, where guards were standing in their ranks, with their muskets upon their shoulders, and snoring as loud as they could. After that he went through several rooms full of ladies and gentlemen, all asleep, some standing, others sitting. At last he came into a chamber all gilded with gold, where he saw upon a bed, the curtains of which were all open, the finest sight was ever beheld. A princess, who appeared to be about 15 or 16 years of age, and whose bright and in a manner resplendent beauty had something in it divine. He approached with trembling and admiration, and fell down before her upon his knees. And now, as the enchantment was at an end, the princess awakened, and looking on him with eyes more tender than the first view might seem to admit of, "Is it you, my prince?" said she to him. "You have waited a long while." The prince, charmed by these words, and much more with the manner in which they were spoken, knew not how to show his joy and gratitude. He assured her that he loved her better than he did himself. Their discourse was not well connected. They did weep more than talk, little eloquence, a great deal of love. He was more at a loss than she, and we need not wonder at it. She had time to think of what to say to him, for it is very probable, though history mentions nothing of it, that the good fairy, during so long a sleep, had given her very agreeable dreams. In short, they talked 4 hours together, and yet they said not half what they had to say. In the meanwhile, all the palace awakened. Everyone thought upon their particular business, and as all of them were not in love, as they were ready to die for hunger, the chief lady of honor, being as sharp-set as other folks, grew very impatient, and told the princess aloud that supper was served up. The prince helped the princess to rise. She was entirely dressed, and very magnificently, but His Royal Highness took care not to tell her that she was dressed like his great-grandmother, and had a point band peeping over a high collar. She looked not a bit less charming and beautiful for all that. They went into the great hall of looking-glasses, where they supped, and were served by the princess's officers. The violins and hautboys played old tunes, but very excellent, though it was now above 100 years since they had played. And after supper, without losing any time, the Lord Almoner married them in the chapel of the castle, and the chief lady of honor drew the curtains. They had but very little sleep. The princess had no occasion, and the prince left her next morning to return to the city, where his father must needs have been in pain for him. The prince told him that he lost his way in the forest as he was hunting, and that he had lain in the cottage of a charcoal burner, who gave him cheese and brown bread. The king, his father, who was a good man, believed him, but his mother could not be persuaded that it was true. And seeing that he went almost every day a-hunting, and that he almost always had some excuse ready for so doing, though he had lain out 3 or 4 nights together, she began to suspect that he was married, for he lived with the princess above 2 whole years, and had by her 2 children, the eldest of which, who was a daughter, was named Morning, and the youngest, who was a son, they called Day, because he was a great deal handsomer and more beautiful than his sister. The queen spoke several times to her son, to inform herself after what manner he did pass his time, and that in this he ought in duty to satisfy her. But he never dared to trust her with his secret. He feared her, though he loved her, for she was of the race of the ogres, and the king would never have married her had it not been for her vast riches. It was even whispered about the court that she had ogreish inclinations, and that whenever she saw little children passing by, she had all the difficulty in the world to avoid falling upon them, and so the prince would never tell her one word. But when the king was dead, which happened about 2 years afterwards, and he saw himself lord and master, he openly declared his marriage, and he went in great ceremony to conduct his queen to the palace. They made a magnificent entry into the capital city, she riding between her 2 children. Soon after, the king went to make war with the emperor Contabaludi, his neighbor. He left the government of the kingdom to the queen, his mother, and earnestly recommended to her care his wife and children. He was obliged to continue his expedition all the summer. As soon as he departed, the queen mother sent her daughter-in-law to a country house among the woods, that she might with more ease gratify her horrible longing. Some few days afterwards, she went thither herself, and said to her clerk of the kitchen, "I have a mind to eat little Morning for my dinner tomorrow." "Ah, madam," cried the clerk of the kitchen, "I will have it so," replied the queen, and this she spoke in the tone of an ogress who had a strong desire to eat fresh meat. "And we'll eat her with a sauce, Robert." The poor man, knowing very well that he must not play tricks with ogresses, took his great knife and went into little Morning's chamber. She was then 4 years old, and came up to him, jumping and laughing, to take him about the neck and ask him for some sugar candy, upon which he began to weep. The great knife fell out of his hand, and he went back into the yard and killed a little lamb, and dressed it with such good sauce that his mistress assured him she had never eaten anything so good in her life. He had at the same time taken up little Morning and carried her to his wife to conceal her in the lodging he had at the bottom of the courtyard. About 8 days afterwards, the wicked queen said to the clerk of the kitchen, "I will sup upon little Day." He answered not a word, but resolved to cheat her as he had done before. He went to find out little Day, and saw him with a little foil in his hand, with which he was fencing with a great monkey, the child being only 3 years of age. There's a picture of Day with his foil fencing with a monkey. He took him up in his arms and carried him to his wife, that she might conceal him in her chamber along with his sister, and in the room of little Day cooked up a young kid, a young goat, very tender, which the ogress found to be wonderfully good. This was hitherto all mighty well, but one evening this wicked queen said to her clerk in the kitchen, "I will eat the queen with the same sauce I had with her children." It was now that the poor clerk of the kitchen despaired of being able to deceive her. The young queen was turned of 20, not reckoning the 100 years she had been asleep. And how to find in the yard a beast so firm was what puzzled him. He took then a resolution that he might save his own life to cut the queen's throat, and going up into her chamber, with intent to do it at once, he put himself into as great fury as he could possibly, and came into the young queen's room with his dagger in his hand. He would not, however, surprise her, but told her, with a great deal of respect, the orders he had received from the Queen Mother. Do it, she said, stretching out her neck. Execute your orders, and then I shall go and see my children, my poor children, whom I have so much and so tenderly loved. For she thought them dead ever since they had been taken away without her knowledge. No, no, madam, cried the poor clerk of the kitchen, all in tears. You shall not die, and yet you shall see your children again. But then you must go home with me to my lodgings, where I have concealed them, and I shall deceive the queen once more by giving her in your stead a young hind. Upon this he forthwith conducted her to his chamber, where, leaving her to embrace her children and cry along with them, he went and dressed a young hind, which the queen had for her supper, and devoured it with the same appetite as if it had been the young queen. Exceedingly was she delighted with her cruelty, and she had invented a story to tell the king at his return how the mad wolves had eaten up the queen, his wife, and her 2 children. One evening, as she was, according to her custom, rambling about round the courts and yards of the palace to see if she could smell any fresh meat, she heard in the ground room little Day crying, for his mamma was going to whip him because he had been naughty. And she heard at the same time little Morning begging pardon for her brother. The ogress presently knew the voice of the queen and her children, and being quite mad that she had thus been deceived, she commanded next morning by break of day, with a most horrible voice, which made everybody tremble, that they should bring into the middle of the great court a large tub, which she caused to be filled with toads, vipers, snakes, and all sorts of serpents, in order to have thrown into it the queen and her children. The clerk of the kitchen, his wife and maid, all of whom she had given orders should be brought thither with their hands tied behind them. They were brought out accordingly, and the executioners were just going to throw them into the tub, when the king, who was not so soon expected, entered the court on horseback, for he came post, and asked with the utmost astonishment what was the meaning of that horrible spectacle. No one dared to tell him, when the ogress, all enraged to see what had happened, threw herself head foremost into the tub, and was instantly devoured by the ugly creatures she had ordered to be thrown into it for others. The king could not but be very sorry, for she was his mother, but he soon comforted himself with his beautiful wife and pretty children. The end. Night-night, children. Night-night. Sweet dreams.